The first insult of the morning was meant to be quiet, folded so neatly into a compliment that no one watching would have called it cruelty. But Wren Ashby heard every word of it through the thin plank wall of the stable loft, where she had been counting feed sacks since before the sun cleared the ridge. She did not turn. She did not set down the sack she was holding. She did not give the voice below her the satisfaction of a sound. Hallowmere lay hunched that October morning beneath a sky the color of old pewter, the whole town seeming to draw its shawls tighter and lean toward the market square, as though gossip itself were a kind of weather rolling in off the moor, and in the yard below the loft Aunt Prudence Hale was telling a neighbor, in the particular voice she reserved for saying unkind things kindly, that the girl upstairs was a good worker, truly, for someone with no family of her own name left to claim her. Unclaimed, that was the word Aunt Prue liked best of all the words available to her, turned over and polished like a coin she meant to spend for the rest of Wren's life, and she used it now the way she always did. Gently, regretfully, as if she were not the one holding the coin at all, but merely reporting its unfortunate value to the market. The words sounded like sympathy. The weight underneath them was accounting. Wren set the sack down at last, evenly, without a sound, and pressed her thumb once against the worn leather of the glove tucked into her apron pocket, the way she had done every morning for 3 years, and did not go down to correct anyone, because correcting Aunt Prue was a game with only one honest outcome, and Wren had long since stopped playing games she could not win in front of an audience. No thunder cracked over Hallowmere to mark the unfairness of it. No curtain fell, no bell tolled in sympathy. The rooster crowed exactly as it had the day before, and the market bell rang its first summons over the rooftops, and the ordinary business of an ordinary morning simply resumed, indifferent, as it always did. The glove she carried was not a matched pair, only the left one, the leather gone the soft gray-brown of a well-used saddle, the thumb reinforced with a scrap of hide that did not match the rest, sewn on by a hand that had cared more for function than for looks. It had belonged to her father. Thomas Ashby had been, in the years before the fire that took the West stable and took him with it, the finest hand with a frightened horse that 3 counties had ever quietly agreed upon, though no one had ever agreed upon it loudly, because loud praise was not the currency Thomas Ashby dealt in. He had trained war horses down from screaming panic with nothing but stillness and a voice pitched low enough that men twice his size had to lean in to hear him, and when gentry from as far as the coast brought him animals no one else would touch. He had taken his modest fee and gone home to a cottage with a dirt floor, and never once complained that the lords who paid him lived in houses with floors of stone. He had raised Wren alone after her mother died birthing her, had taught her everything he knew about horses, and rather more, without meaning to, about people, and the last thing of value he had left her. Besides the glove and a handful of memories that came to her unbidden whenever she caught the smell of hay and leather together, was a saying he had repeated so often it had stopped being advice and become something closer to scripture. Nothing wild needs breaking. It only needs someone worth trusting. She had heard him say it to spooked colts, to grieving widows whose husbands' horses had thrown them, once, memorably, to Aunt Prue herself in an argument about disciplining a child that Wren had not been meant to overhear. She had not understood, at 8 years old, why the words made her father's eyes go soft and sad at the same time. She understood a great deal better now. When he died, everything he owned that could be sold had been sold to settle his debts, and everything that could not be sold, meaning Wren, had been sent to live with her mother's sister because there was, as Aunt Prue liked to remind her, simply nowhere else for an unclaimed girl to go. Uncle Ambrose Hale kept the largest livery stable in Hallowmere, a sprawling, profitable, chronically undermanaged operation that would have collapsed within a season if it had depended on Ambrose's own judgment about horses, which it did not, because it depended instead on the judgment of a 15-year-old girl who had absorbed her father's gift the way other children absorbed a mother tongue without ever being formally taught its grammar. It was Wren who calmed the carriage teams that arrived at the Hale stable trembling and lathered from bad roads. It was Wren who could walk into a stall with a horse no other hand in Hollowmere would enter and come out 10 minutes later, leading the animal like a lamb. It was Wren whose name never once appeared on the ledger because Uncle Ambrose had discovered, early and gratefully, that a girl with no name of her own to protect was unlikely to insist on attaching it to anyone else's success. The gentry who came to collect their gentled horses shook Ambrose Hale's hand and praised his gift, and Ambrose accepted the praise the way a man accepts weather, as something that simply arrived and was his to enjoy, and if he ever felt the smallest itch of shame about it. He had learned to scratch that itch with the reliable ointment of not thinking about it very hard. That was the arithmetic of Hollowmere, as it was the arithmetic of most places. A person without inherited standing could not earn worth through mere competence, only lend it at no interest to whoever already owned the name it would be recorded under. Aunt Prue came up the loft ladder a little after that, her face arranged into the particular fondness she wore when she wanted something, and told Wren, in the tone of a woman bestowing a gift, that she was to come down and help ready the stall for market day, and to wear the blue, and to leave off the glove because it looked, forgive her for saying so, like something scavenged off a dead tinker. It was not a request. Wren said, of course, Aunt Prue, and did not leave off the glove, only slid it deeper into her apron pocket where its shape would not show, because there were battles worth losing in the open and battles worth winning in secret, and she had learned which was which a long time before she had learned to keep her voice steady while doing it. Delphine was already in the yard when Wren came down, turning in a slow circle in a new green wool coat with brass buttons that caught what little light the morning offered, admiring herself in the black window glass of the tack room the way she admired herself in most reflective surfaces, and she greeted her cousin with the particular warmth reserved for people one has already decided cannot be. A rival. "Cousin," she said, "you look industrious, which is such a becoming quality in a girl who has nothing else to recommend her." It was delivered with a smile bright enough to be mistaken for affection by anyone not standing close enough to feel its temperature. The words sounded like a compliment. The intention beneath them was a small, precise blade. Wren said that industriousness was indeed a comfort, since not everyone could be blessed with brass buttons, and went to fetch the cart, and Delphine's smile faltered by exactly the width of a held breath before it recovered, because Delphine had not expected the girl with nothing to have anything left to say back with. That was, Wren had come to understand, the entire secret of surviving a house like this one. Never refuse the insult outright, only hand it back gift wrapped, and let the room decide for itself who had been unkind. Widow Castellan arrived at the stable yard not long after, ostensibly to inspect the horses her late husband's estate still boarded there, though everyone in Hollowmere understood that Widow Castellan inspected very little that did not also allow her to be seen inspecting it. She was a tall, handsome woman with silver-threaded, carefully through dark hair, possessed of the particular social authority that belongs to widows of good families who have outlived the inconvenience of a husband's opinions, and she used that authority the way other people used weather, to explain why certain unpleasant things simply had to be said. She found Wren coiling a lead rope by the gate and paused, tilting her head with an expression of soft, terrible concern. "My dear," she said, "is everything quite all right at home? There have been stories, you understand, about girls in your position, taken in out of charity and expected to earn their bread on their knees in a stable yard. One does worry. It was not a question. It was an audience, facing performance of pity engineered to remind everyone within earshot exactly what Wren's position was. Dressed in the clothing of gentleness so that Widow Castellan could deliver it without anyone accusing her of cruelty. Wren straightened, met the older woman's eyes without flinching, and said that she was very grateful for the widow's concern, and that charity, from what she understood, was measured less by what a person received than by what they were willing to notice was missing. It was a mild sentence. It was also, if one troubled to unfold it, an accusation, and 3 of the stable hands within earshot found sudden urgent business with their brooms to hide their faces. The laughter that followed was not universal. It was enough. By the time the sun had fully cleared the rooftops and burned the morning mist off the river, the whole of Hallowmere had begun its slow annual migration toward the market square for the autumn fair, when farmers from every outlying holding brought their best stock to be sold, admired, and argued over, and the town's ordinary hush gave way to a controlled roar of livestock and vendors and children darting between cartwheels. The square itself had been dressed for the occasion the way an aging woman dresses for a portrait, bunting strung between the eaves of the wool merchants' houses, the fountain at its center scrubbed until the old stone lions looked almost fierce again, the cobbles slick with the morning's rain and gleaming under a sun that had finally, grudgingly, decided to attend. Stalls crowded 3 deep around its edges, cloth merchants beside cheesemakers beside the farrier's forge, its coals glowing orange even in daylight, and above it all hung the mingled smell of wood smoke and wet hay and frying dough and, underneath everything, the particular sharp animal scent of too many horses gathered too close together, restless with the noise. Wren walked the Hale family's best mare through the crowd toward their usual pitch near the fountain, dressed in the plain gray wool Aunt Prue considered suitable for a girl of her position, no ribbon at her collar, no color anywhere on her that had not been chosen for its ability to disappear into a crowd, while 3 paces ahead of her Delphine moved through the same crowd like a lit candle. Moves through a dark room, her green coat drawing eyes the way flowers draw bees turning helplessly toward whichever bloom offers the most nectar, though the nectar in this case was only the reliable sweetness of new money spent well. Wren did not mind the contrast, or told herself she did not, the way she told herself a great many things that were not quite true and had become, through long practice, almost restful to believe. It was the Ravensworth stallion that broke free near the 2nd hour of the fair, a black-coated animal of considerable value and considerably worse temperament, brought to market by a merchant hoping to sell him for breeding and handled, in the moment that mattered, by a stable boy too young and too proud to admit the animal frightened him. A cartwheel struck a stone. A dog barked too close and too suddenly. The stallion reared, tore its lead from the boy's grip as easily as pulling a thread from cloth, and came down through the crowded square like weather arriving all at once. No warning, only consequence. What followed happened in the particular compressed time of true emergencies, in which every observer afterward would remember it differently, and none of them accurately. Stalls went over. A cheese seller's entire table of wheels rolled thunderously across the cobbles, and under the feet of screaming children being snatched up by their mothers. The bunting between the wool merchant's eaves came half down in a tangle as the stallion's flank caught a support pole, and for one full suspended second, the whole square seemed to hold its breath at once. 100 separate conversations dying mid-word, 100 bodies flinching backward in the same instinctive wave. Because a frightened half-ton animal loose among close-packed people is not a spectacle. It is a catastrophe that has simply not yet finished happening. Someone screamed for the town guard. Someone else, more usefully, screamed for everyone to get back, and the crowd obeyed that instruction with the eager, undignified speed of people who had been looking for permission to run. Wren did not run. She had already handed the Hail Mare's lead to a stable hand without quite deciding to, the decision arriving in her body before it arrived in her thoughts. The way her father's decisions always had, and she was moving toward the stallion while the crowd was still moving away from it, which from a distance must have looked less like courage than like a mistake. It was not admiration she felt in that moment, not yet. Only the old familiar quiet that used to settle over her father's shoulders whenever an animal panicked in front of him. A stillness that had nothing to do with the absence of fear and everything to do with what a person chose to do with fear once it arrived. She kept low, kept her steps unhurried in a way that felt, to every screaming instinct in her chest, like walking directly into the mouth of something, and she began, under her breath, the low continuous murmur her father used to use, not words exactly, closer to the sound a person might make gentling a child back from a nightmare, patient and unbroken, and utterly without threat in it. The stallion's ears swung toward her before its eyes did. That was always the first sign, her father had told her once, hands folded over a young colt's neck in the gray light of a winter barn, that a frightened thing was starting to listen instead of only running. Nothing wild needs breaking. It only needs someone worth trusting. She did not think the words so much as feel them arrive in her hands, in the particular unhurried way she raised her bare palm. No rope, no whip, nothing in it a frightened animal could mistake for a weapon. Only an offering, only stillness held out like something a person could choose to walk toward. The square had gone strange and hushed around her. The only sounds left the stallion's ragged breathing and the distant clatter of an overturned cartwheel still spinning itself to rest. And every eye that had not already fled toward safety was fixed now on the small gray figure standing alone in the open space the crowd had abandoned, close enough to the animal's reach that a single wrong step would end badly, and everyone watching knew it. She reached into her apron pocket without breaking her murmured rhythm and drew out the worn glove. Not for its usefulness, there was no time for such a small piece of leather to matter practically, but because her hand wanted the familiar shape of it against her palm, the way another person's hand might have wanted a charm. And she slid it on with the same unhurried patience she brought to everything else, and stepped the last 3 paces forward and closed her fingers, gently, around the trailing lead the stable boy had lost. The stallion's whole enormous body trembled once, a shiver that ran from ears to tail like weather passing over a field, and then, astonishingly, impossibly, to every witness who would later swear they had seen it and still not quite believe it, the animal went still. Not tame, not broken, only quieted, the way a held breath finally releases, and Wren stood with her gloved hand resting flat against the stallion's lathered neck and her own heart going so hard she could feel it in her throat, and said nothing at all, because there was nothing left to say that the moment had not already said for her. The square exhaled all at once, a ragged collective sound somewhere between relief and applause that never quite organized itself into applause proper, because the fair had already begun reassembling its own chaos around the edges of the miracle, cheese sellers scrambling after rolling wheels, mothers still gathering frightened children, the merchant who owned the stallion shoving through the recovering crowd, with his face gone the color of old milk, to seize the lead from Wren's hand without so much as a glance at whose hand it had been in. No one thanked her by name, because almost no one in that crowd knew her name to begin with, and the few who did. Aunt Prue arriving breathless and pale a moment later, Delphine, trailing behind her with a hand pressed theatrically to her collarbone, found it more urgent to exclaim over the ruined cheese stall and the torn bunting than over the girl who had just stood alone in front of half a ton of panicked animal. Someone, in the retelling that would ripple through the square within the hour, would credit Uncle Ambrose's excellent training of his stable staff. Someone else would simply say a stable hand caught it, as though the specific shape of the hand mattered less than the fact of the catching. Wren herself said nothing to correct any of it, because Aunt Prue was already steering her by the elbow back toward their overturned stall with instructions to right the cheese table before the whole morning's trade was lost. And there was, in the end, no melodrama at all, no crowd lifting her onto their shoulders, no grand recognition. Only the ordinary insulting cheerfulness of a market that had frightened itself badly, and now wanted very much to forget it. The fiddler, too, stalls down, striking back up his tune not 5 minutes later as though nothing had happened. The crowd's chatter rebuilding itself layer by layer over the silence the stallion had torn open. No one saw what it had cost her to walk toward that animal instead of away from it. That, too, was familiar. What no one in the square had noticed, in the general scramble of relief and reassembly, was the black lacquered carriage that had drawn up along the north edge of the fair not 10 minutes before the stallion broke loose, nor the man who had stepped down from it to survey the market with the unhurried attention of someone who owned, in the most literal legal sense, the ground everyone was standing on. Hallowe'er sat within the Duchy of Raymore, and the Duke of Raymore visited his market towns rarely enough that his presence was, in itself, an event, though this particular visit had been arranged with characteristic quiet, no herald riding ahead to announce him, no banner raised over the square, only a plain carriage and 2 outriders, and a reputation that traveled faster than any of them. He was known, where he was known at all beyond his title, for a coldness that had less to do with cruelty than with an apparently complete absence of patience for foolishness, for a voice that was said never to rise because it had never needed to, for having ended more than one promising courtship among the coastal gentry with a single flat sentence delivered at exactly the moment it would do the most damage. He had been standing near his carriage, arms folded, watching the fair with the detached interest of a man cataloging an inheritance he had not asked for when the stallion broke free, and while every other spectator in the square had either fled or frozen, the Duke of Raymore had done neither. He had gone very still instead, the particular stillness of a man whose attention has just been seized entirely against his will, and he had watched a plain gray girl in a stable apron walk directly toward a half-ton of screaming animal as though she had done it 100 times before, which, though he could not have known it, she had. He did not move to stop her. He did not call for his guard, though one of his outriders had half drawn a pistol before a sharp, wordless gesture from the Duke put it away again. He only watched, with the fixed, unreadable attention of a man who has spent a great many years learning not to let his face announce what he is thinking, as the girl's bare hand rose in offering and the stallion's trembling stopped, and something in the set of his jaw shifted very slightly, though there was no one close enough to see it and report it, and afterward he would not have been able to say, even to himself, exactly what he had felt in that moment, only that it had been sharp and sudden and entirely unwelcome in its intensity. Not admiration, not yet, but something closer to recognition, the particular jolt of finding a rare thing in a place one had stopped expecting rare things to be. When the crowd surged back in to reclaim the square, he watched the girl get swallowed back into it, ordered by an older woman's hand at her elbow toward an overturned cheese stall, and he watched. With an interest he did not examine too closely, the way she went without protest, the way she seemed to fold herself back down to a smaller size the instant the crisis had passed, as though she had done that a great many times before as well. He turned to the steward at his shoulder and asked, in the quiet, unhurried voice that never needed to rise, who the girl was. The steward, who had been more occupied with the ruined bunting than with any stable hand, admitted he did not know and offered, after a moment's inquiry among the nearest onlookers, the name of the merchant's stable boy who had actually lost the animal in the first place, a piece of misinformation the Duke received with a single flat look that made the steward resolve, silently, to be more careful about his sources in future. The Duke said nothing further about it that afternoon. He filed the moment away instead, the way he filed most things that interested him, without any outward sign that it had lodged itself somewhere it would not easily be dislodged from, and he returned to the business that had actually brought him to Hallowmere, an inspection of the town's grain stores and a meeting with its aldermen that occupied the remainder of his visit, and gave no one watching him any reason to suspect that the most important thing he had seen that day had nothing to do with grain at all. It was 3 days later that the Duke's steward returned to Hallowmere alone, ostensibly to finalize arrangements for a shipment of feed the estate required before winter, and found his way, by a route that was not quite accidental, to the Hale livery stable, where he made a great show of examining several horses he had no real intention of buying before asking. With the studied carelessness of a man executing an instruction he did not fully understand the purpose of, whether the stable employed a girl who had caught a stallion at the autumn fair. Uncle Ambrose, delighted at the prospect of impressing a ducal steward, claimed credit for the stallion's gentling with such fluid confidence that even Aunt Prue, standing nearby, allowed herself a small proud smile at her husband's expense, and it was only when the steward pressed further, describing the girl specifically, gray dress, bare hand, a glove she had drawn on before approaching the animal, that Ambrose's confidence faltered enough to admit that the actual work might have been performed by his niece, who was at present mucking the east stalls and could, if it truly mattered, be sent for. It did apparently matter, though the steward was careful not to say so plainly, and Wren was summoned from the stalls still smelling of straw and horse to stand before a man in fine gray wool who studied her for a long moment with an expression she could not read at all before informing her, in tones that suggested the request came from considerably higher than himself, that His Grace the Duke of Raymore required an assessment of a mare recently acquired for the ducal stables, an animal proving difficult to handle, and that her particular skill had been noted and requested by name, insofar as anyone had thought to learn her name to request it by. Aunt Prue's face, in the moment this request was delivered, performed a small complicated dance between alarm and calculation that Wren watched with the flat, practiced attention of someone accustomed to reading her aunt's expressions for weather warnings, and Delphine, arriving in the yard in time to catch the tail end of the conversation, went very quiet in a way that was, for Delphine, considerably more dangerous than any amount of noise. It was arranged, with a speed that suggested no one in the Hale household considered refusing a ducal request a genuine option, that Wren would present herself at the estate 2 days hence, and the steward departed with his feed order and his errand both accomplished, leaving behind him a stable yard that had gone very quiet in a way it rarely did. That evening, Aunt Prue found reason to remark, gently, over the mending, that it was really quite remarkable what attention a person could attract from doing very little, and that Wren ought to be careful not to let a stroke of luck go to her head, since luck of that kind had a way of running out precisely when a person had grown too fond of it. The words sounded like caution. The intention beneath them was warning, and Wren, threading a needle by the low fire, said only that she would try to remember it, and thought in the small, private room of her own mind where she kept the things she did not say aloud. That she had spent 3 years being told her worth did not exist, and had not yet decided what she would do now that someone with the power to make it matter had apparently, briefly, noticed otherwise. She did not know yet whether that noticing was a kindness or the first thread of a much larger complication, and lying awake that night with her father's glove resting on the blanket beside her hand, she found she was not at all sure, for the first time in a long while, which outcome she was hoping for. By the following morning, the frost had come early enough to silver the cart ruts on the road to Raymore, and Wren walked the 3 miles from Hallowmere with her father's glove tucked inside her coat rather than her apron. Because Aunt Prue had decided, upon further reflection, that a girl summoned by a duke ought to look as though someone had once cared for her, and had produced. From some trunk Wren had not known existed, a coat of deep blue wool with the nap still good along the collar, a coat that had belonged, Aunt Prue admitted only when pressed, to Wren's own mother. It was the first time in 3 years anyone in that household had offered her something without first extracting a price for it, and Wren wore it not because it flattered her, though it did, but because it was the closest thing to being claimed by someone that she had felt in longer than she wanted to count. The gates of Raymore stood open when she arrived, tall iron things worked with a running horse motif that some long-dead Calder had thought a clever joke on a family whose fortune had been built 3 generations back. On exactly the trade Wren's own father had practiced in miniature, and the drive beyond them ran a long, unhurried curve through parkland gone gold and bare, with the season before arriving at a house that did not so much announce itself as simply refuse to be ignored, gray stone gone silver in the morning light, more windows than Wren could count without losing her place. A groom met her at the stable block rather than the house itself, which told her, more clearly than any spoken instruction could have, exactly what capacity she had been summoned in, and she found she did not mind it nearly as much as she had expected to. Because the stable block, unlike the house, was a country she already spoke the language of. The groom's name was Tam. A lanky, freckled young man, perhaps 2 years older than Wren, with the particular cheerful irreverence of someone who had worked for a frightening employer long enough to stop being frightened by him, and he walked her toward the far end of the stable block, talking the entire way about the mare in question. A chestnut called Marigold, who had arrived from a coastal breeder 3 weeks prior, and had since made a considered project of destroying every piece of tack anyone attempted to put near her. "She's clever, is the trouble of it," Tam said, holding the stall door for her. "Clever animals don't panic the way stupid ones do. They calculate, and she's calculated that we're all afraid of her, which, begging your pardon, we mostly are." Wren stood at the stall door for a long moment before entering, doing nothing at all, only watching the mare's ears and the set of her weight, reading her the way her father had taught her to read a room before speaking in it, and it was in the middle of that stillness that she became aware, without turning, that she was being watched from somewhere beyond the stall as well, a second attention layered over the first, quieter and considerably harder to read than the horses. She looked up and found the Duke standing at the end of the aisle, with his hands loosely clasped behind his back, dressed plainly for a man of his rank. Dark coat. No ornament, watching her with an expression that gave away exactly nothing, and she understood, in that first proper look at him, why half of Hallowmere spoke of him the way people spoke of weather they respected and could not predict. He did not greet her. He only said, in a voice pitched low enough that the words seemed meant only for the space directly around them, that he had been told she had a gift with frightened things, and that he wondered whether the gift extended to animals that were not frightened at all, merely disinclined to be governed. Ren considered the question longer than politeness strictly required, because she had learned that answering too quickly was itself a kind of surrender, and said finally that in her experience, most creatures called ungovernable had simply never been offered a reason to cooperate that did not also require them to pretend they wanted to. It was not, she added, a flaw particular to horses. The Duke's face did not change, exactly, but something in the stillness of it shifted. The way a pond's surface shifts a fraction before the wind that will disturb it fully arrives, and he said that was either a very clever observation about horsemanship or a very impertinent one about his household, and he had not yet decided which. "Perhaps both, Your Grace," Ren said, and immediately regretted it, the words out of her before the part of her mind that managed consequences had finished weighing them, because impertinence from an unclaimed stable girl to a duke was not a small currency to spend carelessly, and she felt the old reflexive urge to apologize rise in her throat and made herself, deliberately, swallow it instead. The Duke looked at her for a long moment in which nothing at all happened on the surface of his face, and then he said, dryly, that he supposed a person who could stand still in front of a bolting stallion could be forgiven a certain economy with deference, and turned and left her to the mare without further instruction, which Ren understood, correctly, to be the closest thing to approval she was likely to receive from him that day. She worked with Marigold for the better part of 3 hours, and by the end of it, the mare had accepted a bridle without incident for what Tam swore was the first time since her arrival, and Ren left that first visit with 2 silver coins pressed into her palm by the steward, a Mr. Pellew, precise and gray and visibly unused to handling business he considered beneath his station, and an instruction to return in 3 days' time, because Marigold, in the estate's estimation, required considerably more than 1 visit's worth of governing. She did not see the Duke again on the way out, though she felt, crossing the stable yard toward the drive, the particular prickle of attention at her back that told her a window somewhere above the yard was occupied, and she did not turn to confirm it, because there was a kind of power in not turning that she had learned young and never forgotten. Some things asked to be looked at. The wiser response, always, was to let them wonder whether you had noticed at all. The visits repeated themselves across the following weeks with the steady rhythm of a habit neither party had quite agreed to form, 3 days apart. Then, too, and Ren came to know the estate the way she had once known her father's small cottage, by its particular smells and sounds rather than by any grand tour, the specific creak of the 3rd stall door, the way morning light came gold and slanted through the hayloft window at exactly 10 o'clock. The Duke was present, more often than not, on some pretext or another that fooled no one, least of all Tam, who developed the habit of raising an eyebrow at Ren whenever His Grace found urgent estate business requiring his attention within 20 feet of whatever stall she happened to be working in. And their exchanges, when they occurred, settled into a rhythm of their own, brief, dry, edged with a wit that neither of them acknowledged as flirtation, because acknowledging it would have required admitting it existed. He asked her once, watching her coax a nervous gelding through a farrier's visit with nothing but a low voice and a steady hand, whether she had learned her method from a book. "My father," she said. "He didn't write books. He said the horses that needed the most patience were usually the ones who'd learned, somewhere along the way, that trusting anyone was a mistake." The Duke was quiet long enough that Ren glanced up from the gelding to find him watching her, with an expression she could not immediately place, something that might have been recognition, or might have been its opposite, and he said, after a moment, that it seemed a philosophy that extended rather further than horses, and Wren said that most good philosophies did, and went back to her work before either of them could examine that exchange too closely. It was Lady Augusta, the Duke's grandmother and the closest thing Raymore had to a reigning matriarch, who first said the thing everyone else had been carefully declining to say aloud. She found Wren in a stable yard on a bright, cold afternoon some weeks into the arrangement, having descended from the house unannounced and without any of the ceremony her rank might have warranted. A small, straight-backed woman with silver hair pinned severely, and eyes that missed considerably less than her advancing years might have suggested, and she watched Wren work for a full quarter-hour before introducing herself, which she did with brisk economy, no titles offered or requested. "So you're the girl who caught my grandson's attention without apparently trying," she said. "That's rarer than you'd think. Most people who want it work themselves into knots trying, and he can smell effort at 40 paces. It repels him instantly, always has, even as a boy. You, from what I gather, simply went about your business and let him do the noticing." Wren, uncertain how to answer a statement that was not quite a question, said only that she had not been aware there was noticing to be done, and Lady Augusta laughed, a short, genuine bark of a sound, and said that was, in fact, precisely the trick of it, though she doubted very much it had been a trick at all, more the accident of a girl who had simply never learned to perform for an audience, which, in her considerable experience of watching young women perform for exactly that audience across 5 decades, was the single rarest quality a person could bring into a room. She left as abruptly as she had arrived, but not before pressing Wren's hand briefly, warmly, in a gesture that felt, for reasons Wren could not entirely name, more like being claimed than anything Aunt Prue's borrowed coat had managed. In Hallowmere, the pattern of Wren's visits to Raymore did not stay private for anything like as long as she might have wished. A stable girl summoned 3 times to the ducal estate within a single month was, in a town the size of Hallowmere, roughly equivalent to a public announcement, and the town's considerable talent for conversation turned itself toward the subject with an energy that would have flattered Wren had it not so thoroughly unsettled her. Widow Castellan, encountering Aunt Prue at the draper's, expressed her concern with characteristic warmth, wondering aloud whether it was entirely wise to let a girl of Wren's, she paused delicately here, circumstances, spend quite so much unsupervised time in the company of a man of the Duke's reputation, since gentlemen of rank were known, historically, to take considerable liberties with girls who had no family name substantial enough to object on their behalf. It was concern dressed as sympathy, worn the way Widow Castellan wore most things, for the benefit of whoever was standing close enough to admire the fit of it, and Aunt Prue, who had spent the previous fortnight quietly delighted by the social capital her niece's strange new usefulness had generated, found herself instead newly anxious about what precisely that usefulness might be understood to cost. Delphine, for her part, received the news of the Duke's continued attention to her cousin with a composure that fooled almost everyone, and beneath that composure something considerably less composed had begun, slowly, to curdle. She had been engaged, that autumn, to a merchant's son of respectable if unspectacular fortune, a match Aunt Prue considered entirely satisfactory, and Delphine had, until recently, considered so as well, but a duke's attention, however professionally applied to a horse's temperament, had a way of rearranging a young woman's satisfaction with the arrangements already made for her, and Delphine had begun, in small ways at first, to speak of her cousin in a register that had grown noticeably less affectionate and considerably more precise in its cruelty. The letter arrived at Raymore on a Tuesday in late November, delivered to Mr. Pelew's desk among the estate's ordinary correspondence, with no seal and no signature, addressed in a careful, deliberately unremarkable hand to the attention of His Grace, and its contents, once Pelu had read them with the particular gray stillness of a man realizing he has just been handed a live coal, were carried immediately to the Duke's study, rather than filed with the day's other business. The letter stated, in tones of manufactured reluctance, that certain persons in Hallomer felt a duty to inform His Grace that the girl he had lately taken into his stable's employ, one Wren Ashby, had been observed selling a piece of jewelry to a pawnbroker on the Hallomer High Street the previous Thursday afternoon. A piece which, upon discreet inquiry, had been identified as matching, in considerable detail, a garnet brooch belonging to the Dowager Duchess, last seen in the small drawer of her writing desk and unaccounted for since. The letter did not accuse outright. It merely wondered, in the particular register of concern that Wren had come to recognize as the sharpest weapon available to people who wished to wound without ever being called cruel for it, whether His Grace might wish to satisfy himself as to the girl's character before extending her further trust. It was, Mr. Pellow observed grimly, precisely the sort of letter designed to be believed rather than proven, its author confident that the accusation itself would do the necessary damage regardless of whether any of it survived scrutiny. What Wren felt when Pellew arrived at the Hale stable yard 2 days later with a face like carved stone and the accusation laid before her plainly, without softening, was not quite the panic she might have expected. It was colder than that, and stiller, a kind of falling sensation that seemed to happen somewhere beneath her ribs, while the rest of her stood perfectly, dangerously calm. She had not stolen anything. She had not, in fact, gone anywhere near the Hallomer High Street the previous Thursday afternoon, having spent the entire day at Raymore working with Marigold, under the direct observation of Tam, 2 other grooms, and, for the better part of an hour, the Duke himself. But she understood, even as this fact assembled itself clearly in her mind, that facts had never been the currency that mattered most in situations like this one. A girl with no family name substantial enough to vouch for her, accused of theft from a ducal household, stood to lose considerably more than her position at the Hale stable. Theft from a house of Raymore's standing was not a matter for a magistrate's mild reproach. It was a matter for assizes, for transportation, for the particular finality reserved for people the law had already decided, before any evidence was weighed, were the sort who did such things. Aunt Prue, informed of the accusation that same evening, went white and then, with a speed that told Wren everything she needed to know about where her aunt's loyalties would settle under real pressure, began speaking anxiously of distance, of how the family's own reputation could not be permitted to absorb whatever scandal followed, of whether it might not be wisest for Wren to simply disappear from Hallomer entirely before the constable arrived to make the question of her guilt or innocence someone else's problem to solve. It was not admiration Wren felt, watching her aunt's fear organize itself so quickly around self-preservation. It was recognition, cold and complete, of exactly how much her aunt's affection had always been conditional on convenience, and how little of it would survive contact with genuine cost. She was received at Raymore the following morning, not in the stable block, but in the house itself, for the first time since her arrival there weeks before, shown into a formal drawing room by a footman whose careful neutrality told her nothing at all about what awaited her, and she found the Duke standing at the window with his back to the room, hands clasped behind him in the posture she had come to associate with his most guarded moods, and beside him, seated very upright in a high-backed chair, with an expression of controlled fury that Wren initially, with a lurch of dread, mistook for fury directed at her, Lady Augusta. The Duke did not turn immediately when she entered. When he did, his face gave away nothing at all, And it was this, more than the accusation itself, that frightened Ren most, because in all the weeks of veiled sparring and dry observation, she had come to believe she was learning to read him. And in this moment, when it mattered more than it had ever mattered before, she found she could not read him at all. He asked her, in a voice stripped of all its earlier warmth, flat and formal and entirely correct, whether she had anything to say regarding the accusation that had reached him. It was not an accusation of guilt. It was also, unmistakably, not yet a defense, and the gap between those two things opened beneath Ren like a floor giving way, because she understood, with sudden brutal clarity, that she had allowed herself to believe his notice meant something more settled than it apparently did, that a man's rank could produce warmth in private and still, under public pressure, retreat entirely behind the cold administration of his position. She did not weep. She did not protest with the volume the accusation might have justified. She said, instead, in a voice she was rather proud of managing to keep level, that she had not left Raymore on Thursday, that she had spent the entire afternoon in the West Paddock with Marigold, that Tam and 2 other grooms could confirm it, and that His Grace himself had been present for the better part of an hour, watching. If he cared to remember it accurately rather than convenient to whatever version of events had been delivered to him in writing by someone who had not troubled to sign their name to it. It was Lady Augusta who moved first, rising from her chair with the brisk decisiveness of a woman considerably less interested in propriety than in facts. She said, without any preamble at all, that she had known this girl for the better part of a month, had watched her hands and her manner and her eyes closely in that time, as old women with nothing better to do were entitled to do, and that nothing in any of it suggested a thief, whereas a great deal in the letter itself suggested someone considerably more interested in removing the girl from Raymore than in actually recovering a lost brooch. "My grandson," she said, turning a look on the Duke that made even that composed and formidable man visibly straighten, "has apparently forgotten that believing someone before demanding they prove their innocence is not naivety, it is simple decency, and decency has never once, in my considerable experience, been the thing that made a man look foolish." It was Ren, not the Dowager, who first isolated the anomaly that would eventually unravel the whole business, though it was the Dowager's insistence on examining the letter itself, rather than merely reacting to its contents, that gave her the chance to do it. The letter was produced from Pelu's careful custody and laid on the drawing-room table, and Ren, reading it through for the first time with her own eyes rather than hearing it summarized, felt something cold and clarifying move through her as she reached the 3rd line. The letter claimed she had sold the Brooke to Aldous Finch, the pawnbroker on Hallowmere's High Street, on Thursday afternoon. But Finch's shop, as anyone who had lived in Hallowmere longer than a season would know, closed every Thursday at noon, without exception, because Thursday was the day Finch traveled to the coast to visit his ailing sister, a habit so regular and so well known in the town that half of Hallowmere set their own errands around it. Whoever had written the letter had known enough about Ren's schedule and the Brooke's disappearance to construct a plausible accusation, but not enough about the actual rhythms of Hallowmere's High Street to avoid a detail that any longtime resident would have caught instantly. "There it is," Ren said quietly, setting her finger against the line, and the room went very still around the small, precise fact of it. The unraveling, once begun, proceeded with the particular speed of a lie that has lost its footing. Pelu was dispatched to confirm, discreetly, that Finch had indeed been at the coast that Thursday and had not opened his shop, which took less than a day to establish beyond dispute. Lady Augusta, meanwhile, had turned her considerable attention to the letter's physical construction, the stationery, the ink, the particular hand, and it was here that the second anomaly surfaced, smaller but in its way more damning, because the letter's author had, in the third paragraph, used the phrase "one must admire the creativity of people willing to invent a life for themselves out of nothing." A turn of phrase distinctive enough that Lady Augusta, who had an old woman's memory for exactly this sort of thing, recalled hearing it before, spoken in almost identical words at a dinner party some weeks prior by a young woman with a wide, bright smile and a green wool coat, describing at the time her cousin's unexpected talent with horses. It was not proof enough to hang a conviction on in a court of law, but it was proof enough for a room already primed to believe it, and when Delphine was summoned to Raymore 2 days later, ostensibly to answer questions about a missing garnet brooch her aunt had mentioned in passing, and was shown the letter laid flat upon the same drawing-room table, her composure held for almost a full minute before it did not. She did not confess outright, not at first, offering instead a series of increasingly strained protests about coincidence and common phrases, but Lady Augusta, watching her with the flat, patient attention of a woman who had outlived several generations of people who thought themselves clever, only waited, saying nothing, until the silence itself did the work that direct accusation had not quite finished, and Delphine's composure finally broke on the specific, ordinary detail of the brooch itself, which she had never in fact sold to anyone, having only hidden it in her own room in a fit of angry impulse the week before, meaning to return it quietly once the accusation had done its work and Wren had been removed. One way or another, from a house Delphine had decided, in the wounded arithmetic of her own jealousy, no longer had room in it for both of them. The brooch was recovered from the lining of Delphine's traveling case that same afternoon, and the scandal that followed was managed, as scandals involving the Dowager Duchess's missing jewelry tended to be managed among people of Raymore's standing, with a discretion that kept most of the town from ever learning the full particulars, though Widow Castellan, to her lasting and visible disappointment, found herself with considerably less to say on the subject than she had hoped to have. Aunt Prue's relief at her niece's exoneration was genuine. Wren did not doubt that. But it arrived tangled with a fresh and uncomfortable awareness of how close her family had come to abandoning Wren entirely at the first real cost of standing beside her. And something in Wren, watching her aunt's careful attempts to smooth the last fortnight into a story that reflected better on the household, had quietly and permanently stopped expecting warmth from that particular quarter to mean very much. The Duke said almost nothing to Wren in the immediate aftermath of Delphine's confession, occupied as he was with the practical business of managing a scandal involving his own household's judgment. And it was this silence, more than any accusation Delphine had ever leveled, that unsettled Wren most in the days that followed, because she had watched him, in the drawing room, hesitate before defending her, had seen the cold administrative mask come down over whatever warmth had grown between them across the preceding weeks, and she found she could not simply set that hesitation aside now that the danger had passed, however much the rest of Raymore seemed eager to do exactly that on her behalf. It was nearly 3 weeks later, on an evening that had begun mild and turned, with the particular suddenness November reserved for its cruelest tricks, into something considerably fiercer, that Mr. Pellew arrived at the Hale stable yard on horseback, with rain already soaking through his coat, and informed Wren, with an urgency that sat strangely on a man normally defined by his composure, that His Grace required her presence at Raymore that night, immediately, regarding a matter he had not troubled to explain to his steward, beyond the instruction that she was to come, regardless of the weather. Aunt Prue protested that no respectable errand called a girl out into a storm at such an hour, and Wren, pulling her mother's blue coat around her shoulders and slipping her father's glove into the pocket from long habit, found she could not entirely disagree with the sentiment even as she went to fetch her boots, because whatever waited for her at the end of that dark, rain-lashed road. She understood, with a certainty that had nothing to do with reason, that it was not going to be a conversation about horses. The ride to Raymore took the better part of an hour through rain that came sideways off the moor and turned the road to a dark ribbon of mud beneath the horses' hooves, and by the time the ducal stables rose out of the storm ahead of her, lantern light bleeding gold through a single high window, Wren was soaked through to the skin beneath her mother's blue coat and shivering with a cold that had less to do with the weather than with the particular dread of not knowing what she had been summoned for. There was no steward waiting to receive her this time, no Pelu with his careful gray composure. Only the Duke himself standing in the wide stable doorway with a lantern held low, his coat unbuttoned at the throat in a way she had never once seen it, his hair rain-darkened where he had clearly walked out into the storm to watch for her, and something in the sight of him standing there alone, without the armor of his household around him, made the dread in her chest shift into something else entirely, something she did not yet have a name for. He said nothing as she dismounted, only took the reins from her numb hands and led both horse and woman into the dry warmth of the stable aisle, the same aisle where she had first coaxed a bridle onto a mare no one else could touch, and it struck her. Walking that familiar length of packed earth and straw with the storm hammering the roof above them, that he had chosen this place deliberately, had not summoned her to a drawing room with its careful furniture and its watching portraits, but to the one place at Raymore where the two of them had never once needed rank to understand each other. He led her into the small tack room at the aisle's end, lit a second lamp against the dark, and for a long moment simply stood with his back half turned to her, one hand resting on the doorframe, saying nothing at all, while outside the storm threw itself against the stable walls in long, ragged gusts, and somewhere down the aisle, a horse shifted uneasily in its stall at the sound of it. Wren waited. She had learned, across the strange, slow accumulation of that autumn, that the Duke's silences were not empty, that they were the shape his thinking took before his voice caught up to it, and she had learned, too, that she was no longer willing to fill his silences for him out of nervous habit the way she had once filled Aunt Prue's. When he finally turned to face her, the lamp between them threw his features into a light she had not seen on him before, unguarded, the authority he wore like a second coat set down somewhere on the road behind him. And he said, in a voice stripped of every trace of the flat administrative register she had heard in the drawing room 3 weeks past, that he owed her an explanation he had been a coward for not offering sooner. Wren said nothing. She only watched him, arms folded against the last of the storm's chill, and let the silence do what her silence had always done best, which was to make plain that an apology, if one was coming, would have to earn its way to her rather than simply arrive and expect welcome. I did not speak that day in the drawing room, he said, taking one measured step nearer, because I believed for one unforgivable moment that my silence would protect you, that if I defended you too quickly, too plainly, the whole of Hallowmere would decide the accusation had been true after all, that a duke does not leap to defend a servant unless there is something between them worth lying about. I did not speak because I have spent my whole life watching what happens to anything I claim too openly, a person, a horse, a piece of land, watching how quickly other men's greed or spite finds its way toward whatever I have shown I value, and I told myself that silence was armor I was building for your sake rather than the truth of it, which is that I was afraid. And fear has never once in my life worn the honest name for itself. I did not speak, he said, taking the second step, because some old cold part of me still believed, in that room, for the length of perhaps 30 seconds that I will spend the rest of my life regretting, that proof was owed before belief, when everything I had watched you be for 2 months should have told me the opposite. Should have told me that belief was owed to you the instant the accusation was spoken, freely, without condition, the way my grandmother gave it to you before I did. He was close enough now that Ren could see the rain still caught in his lashes, could hear the unsteadiness beneath the careful evenness of his voice, and he said, quietly, that he had come to understand, in the 3 weeks since, that he loved her, not with the sudden convenient heat of a man dazzled by a stable girl's competence, but with the slow accumulated certainty of a man who had watched someone be patient and honest and unbreakable in 100 small ways no one else had troubled to notice, and that the not speaking, that single, cowardly silence, was the thing he could least forgive in himself, precisely because it had cost her something he could never fully repay. It was not admiration, hearing this. It was something closer to the floor settling back beneath her after weeks of standing on uncertain ground, and Ren found she still could not simply hand him the easy forgiveness his unraveling clearly hoped for, because the accusation had cost her something real. 3 days of believing her own aunt would let her be carried off by a constable rather than absorb the inconvenience of standing beside her, and she was not willing to let that cost dissolve into nothing merely because the man responsible for part of it had finally found the courage to name his failure aloud. "You let me stand alone in that room," she said, her voice steady though her hands, folded tight at her waist, were not. "For the length of 30 seconds, you said. I have stood alone considerably longer than 30 seconds in my life, Your Grace, and I have never once required a title to teach me how to bear it. I do not need your protection now to tell me I was worth defending. I needed it then, when it would have cost you something to give it, and it did not come." The Duke absorbed this without flinching, which she noted, distantly, as its own kind of answer, because a lesser man would have argued, would have reached immediately for the comfort of being forgiven, and instead he only nodded once, slowly, and said that she was right to withhold it, that he was not asking her to erase the 30 seconds, only to know that he had counted every one of them since, and would go on counting them for as long as it took her to decide whether a man who had failed her once, honestly and only once, was still worth the risk of trusting a second time. There was a long quiet after that, filled only with the storm's steady percussion against the roof and the low, uneasy shift of the horses down the aisle. And it was into that quiet that the Duke, closing the last of the distance between them until barely a hand's width of lamplit air separated them, said the rest of what he had ridden out into the storm's teeth to say. "I am not asking you to marry me because it would be convenient," he said, and Ren's breath caught somewhere she had not expected it to, because Delphine's own engagement has taught this town quite enough about the ugliness of convenient arrangements, and I will not add mine to the list. I am not asking because it would silence the gossips. Because a ring on your hand would not erase the word they have spent 3 years hanging around your neck. It would only teach them a new, quieter way of saying it, and I have watched you carry that particular weight long enough to know a title from me would not lighten it half so much as everyone imagines." "I am not asking," he said, his voice dropping further still, unraveling entirely now from the last threads of rank it had ever worn in her presence, because it would look well, because a duke redeeming an unclaimed stable girl makes a pretty enough story for the parlors of the coast to repeat for a season and then forget. "I am asking," he said, "because in a house full of people paid to attend to me, watched by a title I did not choose and cannot set down, you are the only person who has ever looked at me the same way, whether I was standing in a drawing room being deferred to or mucking out a stall at 6 in the morning with no one watching at all, and I find I do not want a future in which anyone looks at me differently depending on who else is in the room. I want to be known the way you know a frightened animal, without performance. without the polish people put on for an audience. "I want that," he said, "even when there is no one left to perform for." "Will you marry me, Ren Ashby? Not because I am a duke, but because when it is only the two of us and the whole of the watching world has gone quiet, I still want you there." Ren had spent 3 years learning that the safest answer to almost anything was silence, and she let the silence stretch now, not out of doubt, but because the moment felt too large to rush through, and when she finally spoke it was with a steadiness that surprised even her, though her eyes had gone bright and unashamedly wet in the lamplight. "Yes," she said. "Because I wish it, not because you are a duke, and not because it would save me from anything, but because I have watched you stand very still in front of frightened things and offer them patience instead of force. The way my father used to, and I did not think I would ever again find someone who understood that stillness was not weakness." "Yes," she said again, quieter, because saying it once did not feel like enough weight for what it meant, and it was the Duke who moved first this time, closing the last inch of distance and taking her bare hand, the glove having long since been shed somewhere in the ride's confusion, in both of his, not pulling her toward him, only holding on. The way a person holds something they have decided, finally and completely, not to let the world take from them a second time, and Ren felt the tears come then. Not the collapse she had spent years refusing to allow herself in front of anyone, but something quieter and truer. The particular release of a person who has held a great deal in for a great deal too long, and is finally, safely, permitted to set it down. He did not let go of her hand while she cried, did not fumble for a handkerchief or fill the silence with reassurance she did not need, only stood there holding on, steady as a post in a storm, and outside the rain began, very gradually, to ease. By the following spring, the whole shape of Ren's life had rearranged itself around a set of facts that would have seemed, to the girl counting feed sacks in Aunt Prue's loft not a year before, closer to a fairy story than to anything a person could reasonably expect. The engagement had been announced formally at Raymore in the depths of that winter, and Hallowmere, true to its nature, had talked of little else for a month, though the talk this time ran warm rather than cutting. Because a girl who had once been called unclaimed marrying the Duke who claimed her was precisely the sort of story a town liked to tell about itself once it no longer had to feel implicated in the unkindness that came before it. Delphine's own engagement had not survived the scandal of the forged letter, her intended's family withdrawing quietly but decisively once the truth of the brooch became impossible to fully contain, and by early spring Delphine had gone to live with a distant aunt on the coast, a departure Aunt Prue described to her remaining neighbors as an opportunity for a change of scenery. Though everyone in Hallowmere understood it for what it was, Widow Castellan had grown noticeably quieter on the subject of Ren Ashby's character, her particular talent for concerned commentary having lost most of its market once concern had been so thoroughly, publicly proven wrong, and she had taken, instead, to speaking of the coming wedding with a warmth so sudden and complete that Lady Augusta, hearing of it, remarked dryly that nothing converted a critic quite so reliably as watching the object of their criticism become impossible to safely criticize any longer. It was Ren herself who had asked, in the quiet months of that winter, while wedding preparations gathered around her, like whether she had not quite decided to let herself enjoy, whether the Duke might use some portion of the estate's land, and some portion of its considerable patience, to establish a yard where horses too frightened or too difficult for ordinary hands could be gentled properly, and where young people with no name substantial enough to open other doors might be taught a trade that did not require one, the way her father had once taught her, freely, in a cottage with a dirt floor that had never once made him feel his worth was smaller for it. The Duke had agreed before she finished asking, and by the time the frost broke that year, the old east paddock at Raymore had been fenced and rebuilt into something new. A low stone building with stalls enough for a dozen difficult animals and a training yard beside it, and above its door, carved into a plain wooden lintel because Wren had refused anything grander. The single word Ashby. Her father's name restored to a trade he had practiced his whole life without ever once being permitted to put his name to it. She kept his glove there now, in a small glass case just inside the entrance, not as a relic too precious to touch, but as a working reminder, and more than one apprentice in the months that followed asked her about the cracked leather and the mismatched thumb. And she told them, every time, the same thing her father had told her. Nothing wild needs breaking, it only needs someone worth trusting. The spring fair came to Hallowmere that year, on a bright, washed morning not unlike the one a year before, when a stallion had scattered the whole market, and a gray, unremarkable girl had walked toward it while everyone else ran, and the town turned out for it in numbers that suggested the previous autumn's chaos had done nothing at all to dull anyone's appetite for a good fare. Bunting strung fresh between the wool merchants' eaves, the fountain scrubbed again until its old stone lions looked fierce, the whole square dressed for a portrait. It was at this fair, by design rather than accident, that the formal dedication of the Ashby Yard was announced to the town at large, a modest wooden platform raised near the fountain, where a year before the Ravensworth stallion had reared free of its handler. And it was from that platform, in the golden hour before noon, with the whole of Hallowmere gathered close enough that the square fell into an unusual, expectant hush, that the Duke of Raymore rose to speak, not as a man reading from prepared remarks, but as a man who had clearly decided, in advance, to say exactly what he meant, and nothing safer than that. A year ago, he said, his voice carrying without needing to rise, because it had never needed to rise, a horse broke loose in this square, and every soul present, myself included, did the sensible thing and stood back from it. One person did not. One person walked toward it, alone, with nothing in her hand but patience and a glove her father left her, and caught what the rest of us were too frightened to approach, and then went back to mucking out stalls before the dust had settled, because no one troubled to ask her name. He paused there, letting the silence hold the weight of it, and Wren, standing near the front of the crowd, in a plain gray dress she had chosen deliberately, no ribbon at her collar, no ornament, felt every eye in the square shift toward her at once, and made herself, with the old familiar discipline, stand still under the weight of that looking rather than shrink from it. They called her unclaimed, he said, and the word landed in the square with the particular ring of a thing finally spoken plainly after a year of being whispered sideways. I have heard that word attached to her more times than I care to count, offered as an explanation for why her worth could be overlooked, her name left off ledgers, her competence handed to other men to wear as their own accomplishment. They were wrong. He let that stand alone for a moment before continuing, and Wren felt the old fragment settle into a new shape entirely, no longer a wound but a thing finally, publicly corrected. She was never unclaimed, he said. She was only not yet claimed by anyone with the sense to see what she was worth. She is the steadiest hand this town has ever quietly relied upon, without troubling to thank her for it. She is the most honest voice I have encountered in a house full of people paid to agree with me. She is. And here his voice softened in a way the whole square seemed to lean into hearing, the reason I believe this town's next generation of frightened, difficult, overlooked things, animal and otherwise, will have somewhere worth going. Because she built it out of nothing but her father's memory, and her own refusal to disappear quietly the way this town once asked her to. The applause that followed was not the polite, dutiful sort that greets most formal speeches from men of rank. It rose from the back of the crowd first, from Tam and the grooms who had watched Ren work all winter, and moved forward in a genuine, swelling wave that caught even the merchants who had once shaken Uncle Ambrose's hand and praised his gift, and Lady Augusta. Standing near the platform's edge with her chin lifted and her eyes suspiciously bright, clapped longer and louder than anyone, and said, to no one in particular, that it was about time this town learned to recognize what had been standing in front of it all along. Ren did not cry in that moment, though she came close, because the crying she had needed had already happened once, privately. In a lamplit tack room, with her hand held fast in his, and what she felt now instead was something quieter and more permanent, a settling, the particular piece of a debt-long owed finally being paid in full. Not to her alone, but to a man 3 years dead, who had never once heard his own name spoken with the respect it had always deserved. The Duke came down from the platform and crossed to where she stood, and took her hand in front of the whole assembled square, not as a private gesture hidden from view this time, but as a public one, deliberate and unhurried, and held it there, in daylight, in front of everyone who had ever called her unclaimed, or looked past her, or handed her competence to someone else's name, and did not let go. The wedding itself, when it came at the height of that summer, was a smaller affair than half of Hallowmere had expected of a duke, held not in the grand hall at Raymore, but in the yard beside the Ashby stables, with the horses themselves looking on from their stalls, and Lady Augusta seated in the front row declaring, to anyone who would listen, that she had chosen the location herself and would not apologize for insisting a wedding be held somewhere the bride actually felt at home. Aunt Prue wept through most of the ceremony, genuinely if imperfectly, the tears of a woman who understood, perhaps for the first time, the full weight of what she had so nearly let slip through carelessness, and Ren, watching her aunt's tears from beneath the modest veil she had chosen over anything grander, found she could forgive the imperfection of that late understanding without needing to forget what it had cost to arrive at, because some things, she had come to believe, were not made less true by having been shared with people who had not always deserved them freely. It was not a perfect family that gathered around her that day, not an easy history that had brought her to it, but it was, she thought, watching the Duke wait for her at the yard's far end with an expression that had long since stopped bothering to hide anything from her, simply and completely shared. And that, she had learned across one long, slow year of veiled duels and quiet recognition. And a single storm-lashed confession was rather more than most people ever received, and more than enough. The dawn that broke over Raymore the following morning, after the last of the wedding guests had gone and the yard had settled back into its ordinary quiet, arrived clean and gold across paddocks still wet with dew. The kind of light that seemed, if a person were inclined to read meaning into weather, to have been waiting patiently on the other side of every storm that had come before it, and Wren stood at the fence of the east paddock in the plain gray dress she still preferred to anything finer, watching a new colt take its first uncertain steps toward a hand it had not yet learned to trust, and felt the Duke's fingers close around hers where they rested on the top rail, not asking anything of her, only staying. She was always worth believing in, and it had taken the world considerably longer than it should have to notice it, but noticing had come at last, plainly, publicly, without qualification, and what remained now was only the long ordinary business of a life built on that belief rather than in spite of its absence. Nothing wild needs breaking, she thought, watching the colt's ears swing at last toward the hand held out to it. It only needs someone worth trusting. The colt took one more step and did not run, and beside her the Duke's hand tightened gently around hers, and neither of them let go, and the light kept coming up gold and steady over the paddock fence, the way mornings do, eventually, after every storm that has ever mattered.